concern that you need to have with the exercise of secret power.
As we learn about the work of the Church Committee 40 years ago, now from November 18th, 1975, here is Senator Frank Church, the committee chairman, opening up a hearing on the FBI and its abuse of power.
There has never been a full public accounting of FBI domestic intelligence operations. Therefore, this committee has undertaken such an investigation. Its purpose is not to impair the FBI's legitimate law enforcement and counter-espionage functions, but rather to evaluate domestic intelligence according to the standards of the Constitution and the statutes of our land. If fault is to be found, it does not rest in the Bureau alone. It is to be found also in the long line of attorneys general, presidents, and congresses who have given power, rather, and responsibility to the FBI, but have failed to give it adequate guidance, direction, and control. Information is a powerful resource. One of the FBI's most significant features is its system for efficient processing, filing, and retrieving of the data it gathers. The potential dangers in this system are obvious. Today we are here to review the major findings of our full investigation of FBI domestic intelligence, including the COINTEL program and other programs aimed at domestic targets, FBI surveillance of law-abiding citizens and groups, political abuses of FBI intelligence, and several specific cases of unjustified intelligence operations. These hearings have one overriding objective: the development of sufficient information for Congress to legislate appropriate standards for the FBI.
After the senator's opening statement, Schwartz and Smothers began their presentation of the FBI irregularities, detailing the broad surveillance activities of the Bureau, mainly in the 1960s, and giving some notable examples.
In the area of what they characterize as the New Left, an example of the overbreadth of the requirements for information laid on the field can be found in the document that's at 13-1 of your books. And in this document, the director of the FBI issued an instruction to all special agents of the Bureau as to the kind of information that he wanted them to collect and report on. Now, the number of items in the report are in letters from A through R and numbers under each one of those entries. I will just refer to a couple of the specific examples of what the FBI agents are required to report into the field. In the area of finances, who are the so-called angels for the group? In the area of publications, describe all the publications. In the area of religion, the policy of what the organization relating to its approach to religion, and any vehement statements made against religious bodies by leaders. Conversely, any statements of support for the movement by religious groups or individuals. In the area of political activities, any and all political activities in which so-called New Left leaders are involved, and details relating to their position taken on political matters, including efforts to influence public opinion, the electorate, and government bodies. In the area of education, all information concerning courses given, together with any educational outline, and together with what is the assigned or suggested reading. In the area of so-called social reform, all information on activities in connection with demonstrations aimed at social reform, whatever that may be. In the area of labor, all information, including all activity in the labor field. With respect to the public appearance of leaders, the identity of any leader who makes a public appearance on radio and television, and who appears before groups, for example, labor, church, and minority groups. And in connection with such appearances, the identity of the group, sponsoring the speaker, and a succinct summary of the subject matter discussed. In the area of mass media, influence of the New Left on mass media, and any indications of support of the New Left by the mass media. A wholly comprehensive listing of everything those people thought or did on any subject you can imagine they're having a concern with. Taking as a next example of how the intelligence desire seeks out information of scarcely relevant to subjects that we had thought the Bureau was concerned with. In the area of women's liberation, report after report about meetings of women who got together to talk about their problems. Now, how the Bureau got this information is not entirely clear, but it's apparently by informants. So we have informants running all over the country, checking up about what housewives are talking about in their efforts to decide whether women should have a different role in the society. Reports on particular women who said why they had come to the meeting and how she felt oppressed, sexually or otherwise. Reports on such important matters as the release of white mice by women at a protest demonstration. Reports on such other important matters as the women's liberation movement is interested in zapping the Miss America pageant at Atlantic City by protesting the standards and well, whatever they protest in Atlantic City. And my favorite example in the Baltimore women's liberation movement, in a document which was sent not only to the FBI, this one's at tab 5.4, not only to the FBI but to 3 military agencies for some reason, a document in which there's a long discussion of the origins, aims, and purposes of the group, its location, its pamphlets, and in concluding on the purposes of the group, comes up with such important findings as they wanted a purpose, and that was to free women from the humdrum existence of being only a wife and mother. They wanted equal opportunities that men have in work in society, and so forth. Nothing to do with violence, nothing to do with these labels of subversion and extremism. And what's the conclusion on the document? Quotes, "We'll continue to follow and report the activities of the women's liberation movement."
Not all of the information collected by the agency was stashed away in some musty file. Much of it was turned over to White House aides, and much of it was used for political purposes.
There was an indication in the '64 Democratic Convention that violence may erupt, and the Bureau was called upon to supply information regarding the potential for violence, assumingly both on a federal level and to assist local law enforcement officials. In addition to that, after infiltration of various groups, the challenge plan of the Mississippi Convention, the plans of those who were challenging the official delegation, were developed by the FBI and submitted to the White House through a White House staffer. The plans of Dr. King, the plans of CORE, the plans of SNCC with respect to activities at the convention were also communicated, both as they related to efforts to disrupt as well as general political strategy at the convention. This was accomplished really through a complete infiltration of these groups, and when it became apparent, as in the case of the Mississippi Challenge, that it might be politically expedient to have some information to discredit the group, the FBI provided that also by providing some bookkeeping data on the organization and its funding sources. We see the same kind of unofficial dissemination occur after the critics of the Warren Commission began to surface, and the White House is a bit concerned about these persons who are criticizing the Warren Commission. The FBI is directed here to gather information on those persons, information which extended to their personal lives, indeed down to and including sex activities. The name check process was often used as a basis of getting a clearer fix on people who had begun to criticize the administration. In several cases, we've identified news correspondents on major networks who apparently at one point or another earned the White House's ire and were the subject of name checks. The number of reporters from major newspapers, many of the names there pop up immediately after revelations or accusations about misconduct or the activities of the White House. We even got to the point where the name check process was used as a basis to gather the views or information on private citizens who have objected to Vietnam policy, and this information was subsequently distributed to persons who may be in a position to point out adverse information in the individual's background. This took the form, for example, of going to political figures and saying to those figures, if you have an occasion to comment upon so-and-so, you might want to have this information. We will talk a little more about that when we come to COINTELPRO activities. The use, though, in a political arena virtually covered the spectrum. In one case, we will deduce information regarding the FBI's reported efforts to influence the Speaker of the House regarding a prominent civil rights figure, using information that had been gained through various investigative techniques and accomplishing this unofficial, over lunch kind of dissemination.
A footnote on the 1964 Democratic Convention. A technique which was used there was the furnishing to the FBI of false press credentials by one of the major networks, which the FBI then used in order to insert itself as a bogus newsman into legitimate discussions of political persons and protest groups and acquire information concerning their plans, pretending to be a reporter, and in fact acquiring it for the purposes of the Bureau and transmission to higher authority. Now, turning to COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO is an abbreviation of the words Counterintelligence Program. COINTELPRO is the name for the effort by the Bureau to destroy people and to destroy organizations, or as they use the words, disrupt and neutralize.
And in pursuit of this goal, FBI agents used a wide range of weapons, disseminating misinformation, creating animosities, and generally spreading havoc among the target groups.
One of the other techniques utilized was to destroy the job or family life. And family life was a particularly opportune target in the Bureau's view, and played on some fairly tender sensitivities. Without mention of the name reflected therein, if you look at tab 9-4 of your books, you will see the Bureau's report on a COINTELPRO effort against a white female who was involved as an officer in what is defined as a local black activist group. The way to discredit or neutralize this leader was to take attention away from activities of the group by creating another kind of distraction. The distraction read as follows: Dear Mrs. Blank, look, man, I guess your old lady doesn't get enough at home, Mr. Blank, I'm sorry, letters to her husband, or she wouldn't be shucking and jiving with our black men in action, you dig? Like all she wants to integrate is the bedroom, and us black sisters ain't gonna take no second best for our men. So lay it on her, man, or get her the hell out of blank. It's signed a soul sister. A particularly effective technique, as reflected by the memorandum, it did succeed in distracting her.
Bureau agents were told to attack the New Left by disinformation and misinformation, and I will give you 6 quick examples of what was done pursuant to that program. There was a body called the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. At the time of the Democratic National Convention in 1968, that body attempted to obtain housing in Chicago for demonstrators who would come to the convention. The FBI local office in Chicago obtained 217 of those forms and filled them out with fictitious names and addresses of persons who purported falsely to have houses in which the demonstrators could stay. The tactic had its designed effect because, according to FBI documents, the persons who went out to look for these houses made, quotes, long and useless journeys to locate the addresses, and the effort to find housing was canceled. And what effect that had upon the attitude of the persons who were there in Chicago and what contribution that made to what happened thereafter, I suppose we'll never know. Precisely the same tactic and program was carried out by the Bureau with respect to the 1969 presidential inauguration, where they again filled out false housing forms to confuse and disrupt efforts by persons coming to Washington to find places to stay. During those same 1969 inauguration ceremonies, the Washington field office of the FBI discovered that persons who were attempting to coordinate and control the demonstrations. Now, there were marshals, and this committee has examined in executive session Mr. Eagle Crow, who was responsible for coordinating law enforcement at that demonstration, and he has told us that the marshals of the demonstrators were a very useful and helpful group of persons in order to keep the demonstration orderly. Now, what did the FBI do? They found out what citizen band was being used for walkie-talkies, and they used that citizen band to supply the marshals with misinformation, and pretending to be a unit of the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, countermanded the orders issued by the movement. In 1967, there was a rally in Washington protesting the Vietnam War. A newspaper in New York City indicated that its contribution to this rally was to be the symbolic act of dropping flowers on the Pentagon. And the newspaper put an ad in the newspaper asking for a pilot who could help them do that. The Federal Bureau of Investigation answered the ad, and it kept up the pretense that it was a genuine pilot up to the point when the publisher of the newspaper showed up with 200 pounds of flowers and there was no one there to fly the plane.
The most dramatic testimony today involved the surveillance of Martin Luther King. The committee staffers described in detail attempts to discredit and to destroy King, to try to turn his followers against him, even to find another idol for black Americans. Martin Luther King was and is a national hero to millions, but to J. Edgar Hoover, he was a dangerous man who would wreck the country.
By January of '62, Mr. Hoover has already typed Dr. King as no good. Hoover is particularly disturbed after, in 1963, it became clear that the concept of nonviolence was gaining adherence, adherence to be made even more clear by the time the March on Washington came around. This development of the concept of nonviolent confrontation or nonviolent protest was seen as a threat to law enforcement and something the Bureau was indeed unhappy about. This was aided, apparently, by what the Bureau regarded as Dr. King's direct attacks on Mr. Hoover and the Bureau. And the public controversy was pretty much full-blown at the time, in 1963, when Mr. Sullivan, who should be able to give us some assistance on this matter, communicates to Mr. Hoover a plan for dealing with Dr. Martin Luther King. Quoting from a memorandum, the plan here is to completely discredit Dr. King by, quote, taking him off his pedestal and to reduce him completely in influence. In its effort to reduce Dr. King in influence, to take him off his pedestal, and to change, if you will, his image before the masses, we began to get some insight into the thought process of the FBI at this time. The thinking was that this would not be a terribly difficult task. The memo indicated, for example, that this can be done and will be done. Obviously, confusion will reign, particularly among the Negro people. The Negroes will be left without a national leader of sufficiently compelling personality to steer them in the proper direction. So the FBI decided that if they were going to take King off his pedestal, it was a part of their task to find and bring into prominence a new, quote, national Negro leader.
After the March on Washington, there was an acceleration. He was defined because of his speech in that demonstration in Washington as the most dangerous and effective leader in the country, and there was a paper battle within the Bureau as to how best to attack him, and he was attacked. After Time magazine named him as Man of the Year, again the Bureau finds that reprehensible, believes it must attack and destroy. When he was given the Nobel Prize, again they seek to discredit Dr. King with the persons who welcomed him back from that award. When he began to speak out against the Vietnam War, there's a new crescendo of efforts by the Bureau to discredit and destroy Dr. King. When the Poor People's Campaign took place, once again they go after Dr. King. And their activity to go after Dr. King didn't even cease when he died, because as Congress began to consider the question of whether or not Dr. King's birthday should be named and made a national holiday, the Bureau developed plans to call in friendly congressmen for off-the-record briefings concerning King, in the hopes that those congressmen could keep any such bill from being reported out of committee. The period surrounding the March on Washington and directly following it is particularly revealing. A report was written for the director by his chief intelligence officer, reporting that the Communist Party, in fact, for 40 years had been trying to control the Negro movement, and that it had always failed, and that its efforts in connection with the March on Washington were infinitesimal. This was not accepted by the director of the FBI. He found that thinking wrong, unacceptable, and said that it must be changed, and it was changed. And then we find paper coming in which the lower-level people in the FBI apologize for having misunderstood matters, and on they go with this effort to discredit, and start they do the bugs on Dr. King. The FBI sought to prevent the Pope from meeting with Dr. King. It intervened with a cardinal.
To prevent the Pope?
The Pope.
From meeting with Dr. King?
It did. And when the Pope, despite that effort, did meet with Dr. King, the FBI documents record the adverb astounding.
Must have been Pope John, was it?
It was in 1964. Now, someone's got to help me on that. Who was the Pope then? Pope Paul.
Was it Pope Paul?
In any event, that effort didn't work. The paranoia, the belief that American citizens couldn't deal themselves with Dr. King is indicated by this story. At one point, Governor Rockefeller was planning a trip to Latin America, and the Bureau felt that it had to approach Governor Rockefeller so he was planning to see Dr. King before going, so that he could be warned of what a great danger Dr. King was. This effort went on and on and on. Each time that he was doing something important, there was an effort to discredit him. Each person who the Bureau felt could give further credit, further recognition to Dr. King, an effort to stop that from happening. The Bureau went so far as to mail anonymous letters to Dr. King and his wife, which were mailed shortly before he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and finishes with this suggestion. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. It was 34 days before the award. You are done.
If I can interrupt, that was taken by Dr. King to mean a suggestion for suicide, was it not?
That's our understanding, Senator.
Who wrote the letter?
Well, that's a matter of dispute. It was found in the files of Mr. Sullivan, who was the assistant director of the FBI and was heavily involved in these programs. He claims that it's a plant in his files and that someone else in the Bureau, in fact, wrote the document. The document which was found is a draft of the letter which was the anonymous letter which was actually sent.
Is there any dispute that the letter did in fact come from the FBI?
We've heard no dispute of that.
One thing that is very clear as we examine the King information is that the FBI has not only presumed to know an awful lot about the movement which Dr. King headed, but that many of its fumbling efforts, many of its failures to convince people that Dr. King should be discredited, was born out of the ignorance and, if you will, the very clear racism at large then in the agency. A particularly revealing aspect of the Bureau's approach to the question, even at a time when they were examining the so-called Negro question, is evidenced by the response to a memorandum which then Attorney General Kennedy wrote to Mr. Hoover. Mr. Kennedy wrote a memorandum asking Mr. Hoover how many Negro special agents he had. Mr. Hoover wrote back, "We don't catalog people by race, creed, or color." And now reading from Mr. Sullivan's transcript on the point, it was assumed by Mr. Hoover that this would take care of Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy came back with another very nice letter. That's a little laudatory attitude. You are commended to have it. But I still want to know, how many Negro special agents do you have? So we were in trouble. It so happened that during the war, he had 5 Negro chauffeurs. So he automatically made them special agents. Did not matter whether they finished college or high school or grammar school or had a law degree. So now we wrote back and said we had 5. Then Mr. Kennedy came back and said this was atrocious. At the time, according to Mr. Sullivan, the FBI had 5,500 special agents. Out of that number, 5,500, and you only have 5 Negro agents? Mr. Sullivan again, of course we did not say in that memorandum that none of them conducted investigations. They were just drivers. This is 1961. Is it any wonder that the FBI was later presumptuous enough to feel that it could determine the next new national Negro leader? It's part of the problem as they attempted to translate the tactics used first against the Communist Party against virtually every perceived enemy as the Bureau looked across the landscape and decided who should be neutralized, discredited, or destroyed.
As we all know, the Bureau was originally set up as a crime-fighting agency. But in 1939, in a directive by President Roosevelt, it assumed a new task of seeing that the country's internal security was maintained in the face of a growing threat from fascism and communism.
In 1939, the FBI had and established an index called the Security Index, which was a list of individuals, both aliens and citizens, I'm now quoting, on whom there is information available to indicate that their presence at liberty in this country in time of war or national emergency would be dangerous to the public peace and safety of the United States government. The documents which notified all FBI offices of such lists and to prepare names indicated that the Bureau should make certain that the fact it was making such investigations does not become known to individuals outside of the Bureau. Nevertheless, the Department of Justice was then informed, and in 1941, the Department of Justice commenced to work with the Bureau on classifying persons as to degree of dangerousness. In 1943, however, the Attorney General then in office, Mr. Biddle, wrote a memorandum for J. Edgar Hoover, in which he instructed J. Edgar Hoover to get rid of the lists and to stamp on each document in which a person had been given a classification for the purpose of being locked up the following legend: "This classification is unreliable. It is hereby canceled and should not be used." Attorney General Biddle told J. Edgar Hoover that after full reconsideration of these classifications, I am satisfied that they serve no useful purpose. There is no statutory authorization or other present justification for keeping a custodial detention list of citizens. The Department fulfills its proper functions by investigating the activities of persons who may have violated the law. It is not aided in this work by classifying persons as to dangerousness. Now, within a few days of that instruction, very flat instruction from the Attorney General, the director of the FBI indicated to all FBI agents that the instruction, in effect, indicated that the instruction should not be carried out. He told them that what they should do is simply to change the label on the files from, quote, security matter to, quote, security matter, and from, quotes, custodial detention. And he instructed the agents of the FBI as follows: that the Bureau will also continue to prepare and maintain security index cards, and this was for the same purpose of knowing who the Bureau might lock up. And he further instructed them the fact that the security index and security index cards are prepared and maintained should be considered as strictly confidential and should at no time be alluded to in investigative reports or discussed with agencies or individuals outside the Bureau other than representatives of the military intelligence agencies who were going to be let in on the secret. In 1948, there was a new Attorney General in office, and he, contrary to Attorney General Biddle, who had instructed that this be turned off, the new Attorney General in 1948 instructed the FBI to prepare an emergency detention program following something called the Attorney General's portfolio. This included plans to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. It included ultimately plans for a master warrant of arrest, whereby on the signature of the Attorney General and only that signature and without reference to the courts, thousands of people could be locked up.
Have they continued to maintain these files for lockup purposes?
The key question is your last three words, Senator. They have continued upon the agreement of the Department of Justice to maintain the same files. The numbers have now been reduced to 1,200 persons. The name has been changed to something called the Administrative Index. What purpose that serves and whether it still is used as a reserve list of persons to lock up, I think we're going to have to ask the Bureau, and I can't give you a definitive answer.
Well, for most of the hearing, the members of the Senate committee sat silently listening to the documentation of abuses from staffers Schwartz and Smothers. One senator said he regarded the FBI wrongdoing as more serious than the CIA wrongdoing. All were stunned and appalled by the disclosures, and at day's end, several gave vent to their feelings.
I've been told for years by, among others, some of my own family, that this is exactly what the Bureau was doing all the time. And in my great wisdom and high office, I assured them they were on pot. This just wasn't true. Couldn't happen. They wouldn't do it. What you've described is a series of illegal actions intended squarely to deny First Amendment rights to some Americans. And that's what my children have told me is going on. Now, I didn't believe it. The trick now, as I see it, Mr. Chairman, is for this committee to be able to figure out how to persuade the people of this country that indeed it did go on. And how shall we ensure that it never happen again?
And I would hope as we lead to the strengthening of the FBI in the criminal field, we impose very clear and unquestioned limits so that this kind of unrestrained, illegal, secret intimidation and harassment of the essential ability of Americans to participate freely in American political life shall never happen again.
Seems to me that we have moved away from concern by the Bureau for actual actions that might be violent or might be criminal, toward action toward ideas that might be unpopular or may not be acceptable to some people within the Bureau or perhaps within the administration.
The FBI has never had a statute clearly defining its authority. And after all these many years, this is the first serious congressional investigation of its activities. And we have seen today the dark side of those activities, where many Americans who were not even suspected of crime were not only spied upon, but they were harassed, they were discredited, and at times endangered through the covert operations of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Such revelations place a serious responsibility upon this committee to see to it that that can't happen again.
Fritz Schwartz, as a result of the committee's investigation, did you ever learn who wrote that letter to Martin Luther King or who authorized it?
Well, I think it was a man called Sullivan who we examined. Actually, Senator Montail took his deposition up in New Hampshire, and then he died before we could call him at a public hearing. But he was head of the domestic intelligence group under J. Edgar Hoover, and I think he was the person who did it. Whether Hoover himself authorized, I'm certain Hoover would not have objected, because all of the so-called COINTELPRO proposals, like, for example, one in Chicago where the FBI tried to get one black leader to kill another black leader by sending an anonymous letter to the one they wanted to do the killing. But all of those actions were authorized by Hoover, and he would say, okay, go ahead and do it so long as you don't embarrass the Bureau. That was the exact word, so long as you don't embarrass the Bureau, by which, of course, he meant so long as you can keep it secret. But we didn't find internal evidence in the FBI beyond our being certain that Mr. Sullivan had been responsible for producing that letter. We didn't find internal evidence about whether the approval went up to Hoover. A lot of Hoover's documents, the day he died, his famous close secretary and one of his closest aides went through his files and destroyed a lot of them. Fortunately, they didn't destroy everything, and we found an enormous amount, but it may be there was a over-approval of the suicide letter, but that was one of the things that was destroyed. I don't know the answer to that.
Mr. Maxwell, do we know, did the committee find out what impact this had on Dr. Martin Luther King at the time?
Well, I think it was, I'll leave that to Fritz to answer, because Fritz was much more deeply involved in the domestic side than I was. So,
all right. Was there any witness who testified whether or not the FBI's was Dr. Martin Luther King aware of the FBI's surveillance of him, and did it affect his activities?
Yes, he was, and yes, it did affect his activity, but it didn't suppress his activity. But that letter, which was received and talked about not only between King and his wife, but between King and his close advisors, was of great concern to them. It just proved further the extent to which the FBI was trying to hurt them. I mean, the FBI peddled information about King to the Pope, to the White House, to universities, to foundations, to foreign leaders. They tried to prevent his getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But you know, Eliot made a great point, where he used Phil Hart for this. The King, of course, is a known counter-leader to the practices of J. Edgar Hoover, but the FBI did things that injured all kinds of people. Civil rights leaders, where they would write anonymous letters trying to break up marriages. Unitarians from Ohio who traveled to Chicago for the Democratic Convention in 1968, where the FBI used false information to have them not have housing and get all mixed up in where they were staying. An actress who did commit suicide after the FBI had peddled information about her relations with people of another race. And it was deeply, deeply disturbing that a law enforcement agency knowingly and intentionally violated the law and did it in ways that were designed to hurt lots of ordinary people and lots of significant and famous people.
In just a few minutes, you're going to see 30 minutes of the Deputy Associate FBI Director, whose name is James Adams, who appeared before the committee the day after the Martin Luther King revelations. But to give you a taste for what that 30 minutes is like, let's show you a short clip of Democratic Senator Phil Hart questioning Director Adams. It's the segment that we just heard about from Mr. Maxwell. Let's watch.
There were an awful lot of people who never got close to a Nobel Prize, whose name is Jones and Smith, that my review of the file show had violence done to their First Amendment rights. And Nobel Prize winners will always get protection, but Joe Potatoes doesn't. And this committee should focus on him too.
Joe Potatoes, quite a memorable reference by Senator Phil Hart. We're going to show the entirety of this in a few minutes, and you talked about the impact of this on you, Mr. Maxwell, but would you give us a sense of what the atmosphere was like in that room at the time?
I think it was electric. The extent of what the FBI had done was almost unbelievable. And it came against a public backdrop about the FBI, which was the crime busters, the elite police activities on the federal level, incorruptible, unbeatable, a bulwark of American institutions. And to think that these things had been going on below the surface, and in such contrast to the image of the FBI, was extraordinary.
Sure, and we should tell people, because this is such a vintage time, but that image was propelled by Hollywood, because there were, in the popular culture, the FBI agent was always the type of person that you described. So this was a real revelation to the public that there were two sides to it.
Absolutely. It was the untouchables, in a sense, and all of a sudden to think that the untouchables had been doing things that were so destructive, so wrong, so in violation of the oath that they took was, I think, almost unimaginable at the start of the investigation.
So thanks to Elliot Maxwell and Fritz Schwartz for setting the stage for this. And up next, you're going to see from November 19th, 1975, the PBS broadcasting of this hearing. And it's anchored by Paul Duke, which might be a familiar name to many of you watching. And it's the edited highlights of testimony of Deputy Associate FBI Director James Adams. Let's watch.
From the outset today, it was plain that much of the interrogation would revolve around the committee's disclosures yesterday of the attempts to discredit Dr. King, an intensive campaign that was waged over a 7-year span. The hand of Hoover was everywhere in the harassment of Dr. King. Adams told of 25 separate acts, acknowledging there was no legal basis for any of them. As we pick up the proceedings, Adams is being questioned about an anonymous letter sent to Dr. King in 1964, shortly before he received the Nobel Peace Prize, a letter which some suggest was an attempt to induce suicide. Democratic Chairman Frank Church quoted directly from the letter.
King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do this. Exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. You are done. There is but one way out for you. Now, if you had received such a letter, how would you have interpreted it? What would you have thought it meant?
I have read that statement. I have heard the conclusions of your staff that it was a suicide urging. I can't find any basis upon which they drew that conclusion. I think that approaching it from an objective standpoint, as I read it, I don't know what it means. I think rather than a conclusion, it should be a speculation in a realm of possibilities as to what was intended. But I cannot, I don't understand the basis for it. It's a possibility, but I certainly would not reach such a conclusion from my reading of that statement.
Now, if you had received a letter of this kind, and it had been directed to you, and you were in Dr. King's position, and you read, King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. Now that happens to roughly correspond to the time before which he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. What would you think that meant?
I would have to consider what I was being accused of. I would have to consider what the facts were. I would have to consider what the intent of the person was. Writing such a note coming just before Christmas, I don't know if it means is an urging to repent from something this person, whoever he was that sent it. I have no idea what it means.
Certainly no Christmas card, is it?
It's certainly no Christmas card.
It reads, you are done, there is but one way out for you. What does that mean?
I don't know. I don't know if it means confession. I don't know if it means suicide as has been raised. I have no idea. You have the statement. I'm not in a position to say. I haven't interviewed anyone that was with him at the time he received it.
Would you disown this statement and say that any connection the FBI had with it was utterly improper and grotesque?
I certainly would say it was improper, and I can't justify its being prepared or sent. Yes, sir.
I gather that there was never any question raised about whether Dr. King was a communist. That was never charged.
Not as a Communist Party member,
Right,
no, sir.
that's right. Never a member. Or that he was about or had committed acts of violence.
No.
All right. But the peg for investigating was apparently that he was subject to communist influence.
Yes.
Now, what makes that a justified reason for investigating him? Is it a crime to be approached by someone who's a communist?
No.
Well, what is the legal basis for that investigation?
The basis would be the communist influence on him and the effect it would have upon the organization. Would be in connection with our basic investigation of the Communist Party.
Yeah, well, as I understand the law today, it is not a crime to be a member of a communist party.
That's correct.
How can it be a crime to know someone who is a member of the Communist Party?
It isn't.
Well, then how do you investigate something as tenuous as that? What is the basis for it legally?
Well, it falls into the area of, one, the intelligence jurisdiction of the activities of the Communist Party. You have a situation where an individual in an organization, a leader of an organization, efforts are being made to influence him and achieve control over the organization, and it's part of the overall investigation of the